This could perhaps be a rainforest scene in Amazonia, the Congo, or Indonesia. But no, it's Scotland. Were you aware that the Scottish landscape is being abused to this extent? Maybe you've visited and been puzzled to see wide expanses of devastation in so-called beautiful, unspoilt Scotland. This presentation is about officially sanctioned biodiversity loss in our own country. Sir David Attenborough, we are facing a crisis, and one that has consequences for us all. The impacts of biodiversity loss are no longer a threat for future generations to face. We ourselves must do so. Much of the Scottish landscape has been given over to dense plantations of fast-growing, non-native coniferous trees, mostly Sitka spruce, a low-maintenance supply of basic quality timber. In the 1940s, UK national policy was to grow a tree crop, and 70 years on, that crop must be harvested. The resulting environmental impacts are plainly evident, indeed obvious, as clear felling spreads across the landscape, patch by patch. After the Second World War, when a need for timber was perceived, natural vegetation was obliterated by tightly planted spruces. And now, because of the indiscriminate industrial harvesting techniques employed today, large areas of the landscape are turned into scenes of sheer devastation, from which condition they will take centuries to recover. When tackled on the subject, foresters gravely assure us that, regrettably, because of economic constraints, there is no kinder alternative to their far from subtle Tonka toys, the harvester that chops the trees down, and the forwarder, which transports them to storage areas and then loads them onto a fleet of lorries. The website Visit Scotland proudly asserts, travelling a little can make a big difference. Explore our countryside, hills and landscapes, awe-inspiring landmarks, etc., etc. Of course, please do come and explore the Scottish countryside and coastline, where glorious views like these can be experienced when the weather allows. But don't be surprised if, whichever way you look, the view has been violated in one way or another by incongruous non-native trees or destructive forestry operations. This distant plantation, featured in several slides, is now being demolished and is already an offensive scar on the landscape. As the plantations are clear-felled, haphazard networks of deep ruts appear, soil crushed and compacted by the huge wheels of forwarders gathering the timber, plus access roads bulldoze across the hillsides to give access to the trucks that transport logs away from the site. Assault on the aesthetic and rational senses diminishes the scenic value of almost every sea loch in Scotland. The salmon farms. Seen at a distance, they might not seem that bad, but they become more noticeable and more offensive once you know the extent of the pollution and the many other environmental problems they cause. Because the fish farms are so widely established here, a square kilometre of the Isle of Skye has been levelled to accommodate a fish feed plant to serve the salmon farms. Incredibly, this hideous factory was installed adjacent to the Skye Bridge, a delightful welcome for arriving visitors, don't you think? Let's get back to forestry. The foreground here was recently harvested of its spruces, beautiful in their natural American forest habitat, but thoroughly inappropriate in this Highland landscape that features the world-famous Elandonnan Castle, just out of the picture on the left. Before long, the entire hillside opposite, across Loch Duich, already an extensive, unpleasant plantation, will also become similarly defaced. That Loch Duich view was from partway up the pass known as Bealach Ratagan, that takes us over the hills to Glenelg. From various points along the way, if we mentally edit out various disfigurements contributed by forestry operations, we experience breathtaking views of Loch Duich, Morven and the Kintail Mountains. Next we turn off along the scenic Glenmore Road to Moyle. Here's an impression of the awe-inspiring landmarks visitors can soon expect to see, a bit more than a mere blot on the landscape. So does modern forestry make good sense, ecologically speaking? In my opinion, certainly not. This highland hillside was planted with incongruous non-native coniferous trees and then, recently, laid waste by harvesting them. Less than a century ago, this apparent bomb site was part of a grand expanse of ancient woodland in the Scottish Highlands by Loch Ness. This part of Glen Moriston used to be Coy Livishi, that is, Livishi wood, but now everything there, including the soil and even the bedrock, has been utterly ravaged just to produce a crop of cheap timber. What, would you say, is the difference between any log tropical rainforest and a clear-felled Scottish spruce plantation? In terms of their remaining biodiversity and ecological integrity, very little. Both may be considered severely impoverished. Whatever happened to Coy Livishi? Pre-World War II, that gorgeous natural woodland would have looked very much like this. Thanks to widespread human intervention during the decades following the war, Coy Livishi would have become like this. Then, in November 2009, demolition of Coy Livishi, no longer woodland but a plantation of harvestable age, began. So far, only a small fraction of the Glen Moriston spruces have been harvested. But the resulting wasteland is, frankly, shocking. To describe this environmental impact, the most appropriate word available is a relatively new one: ecocide. The term ecocide was coined during the Vietnam War in order to rationalize the appalling biocidal and concomitant homicidal effects of the notorious defoliant Agent Orange. It was adopted in 2010 by campaigner Polly Higgins as an appropriate label for the careless eradication by humans of species and habitats around the world, to our intense detriment. Can anybody persuade me that this does not constitute ecocide? The main difference between the demolished tropical rainforest and the harvested Scottish plantation is that the first is a single-stage operation, whereas the destructive change from wild woodland like Coy Livishi to this broken landscape has a 50-year intermediate coniferous plantation phase. The outcome in both cases is still ecocide. The definition of ecocide fits the destructive impacts of conifer forestry perfectly. It's happening all over Scotland, exemplified here by the ecocidal history of Coy Livishi. What callous madness turned this into this, and then into this? In recent years, much of Scotland has taken on the appearance of a bomb site. Is this what we want, scenically, biologically, socially and economically? Is this what the tourists come to see? Whatever must they think of Scotland? What is this sort of, air quotes, land management good for? What sort of standard operating procedures advocate this sort of treatment of the Scottish landscape and its biodiversity? Why do this to Scotland? Has Britain really learnt nothing about the consequences of land abuse? There is nothing much we, in the 21st century, can do about the approximately 4,500 square kilometres of coniferous plantation planted by modern foresters' forebears, who had already felled much of Scotland's native woodlands to supply timber needed to wage 2 world wars. So, could anything be done to improve on the current way of clear felling? Replacing woodland with conifers may have been expedient in the past, but with hindsight, we can rationalise the ecological mistakes made since the National Forestry Commission was established a century ago in 1919. As a final example with an observed timeline, let's take a look at the sad history of land opposite my Highland home, Avenish Hill. In the distant past, it was wooded, probably very much like the section remaining at its shoreward end, where a remarkable community of 15 tree and shrub species grow today, including oak, aspen, wych elm, and the uncommon rock whitebeam. A few small islands of the old woodland, they show pale and sunken here, hung on among the planted spruces, the trees, oak, hazel, yew, and wych elm, with a struggling assortment of woodland floor plants, including a few scraggy ferns and courageous bluebells. The 18th century Roy map shows what we might be tempted to interpret as deciduous woodland on Avenish Hill. However, the 1885 Ordnance Survey map shows it as coniferous. I can't say whether the trees would have been planted spruce introduced to Britain in 1831, but if so, they will not have been those harvested 2017 to 19. Native Scots pine is perhaps more likely, possibly represented today by the little group of pines that grow on a bare rock outcrop at the west end of the plantation area, while we note that Scots pine is plentiful in wild woodland just a short distance westward. Of course, I recognise that, thanks to ill-advised planning in the past, the spruces are here, in this case were here, that they have a finite lifespan, and now they have to go. It's the harvesting method that slams the coffin lid on native biodiversity, catastrophic declines instigated by the original plantings and continued during 50 to 70 years of darkness-inducing spruce cover, and then clear fell harvest. Could a less destructive alternative to big machine harvesting be devised? I can't say, but I am convinced that the current way of clear felling is just plain wrong, certainly for biodiversity, and is in need of reform because... Remind us, please, David. We are facing a crisis. The future of all life now depends on us. I submit that this is not the best way for us to go about it. What do you say, Ed? Look closely at nature. Every species is a masterpiece, exquisitely adapted to the particular environment in which it has survived. Who are we to destroy or even diminish biodiversity? Nobel laureate Professor Johann Ropström provides a fine metaphor for the consequences of biodiversity loss. The value of biodiversity is that it makes our ecosystems more resilient, which is a prerequisite for stable societies. Its wanton destruction is akin to setting fire to our lifeboat. Can it be that the standard operating procedures, SOPs, used by foresters recommend land management practices that result in not just occasional reductions, but indeed the eradication of biodiversity? Does the United Nations precautionary principle mean nothing to the authorities? Well, I'm afraid our experience with other environmental issues in Scotland confirms no. To them, the precautionary approach is inconvenient and is therefore routinely deprioritised. So much for beautiful, unspoilt, bonny Scotland. Life on this planet has evolved from zero into approaching 10 million different organisms living as communities of individuals that work together. Biodiversity. No creature of any sort, even the COVID-19 virus, exists in isolation, and all must remain together in their multiplicity of configurations if communities, that we call ecosystems, are to function properly. That is to where several billions of years of evolution has taken nature, complexity that will not survive a sustained assault of destructive simplification by self-centered humans. If we remove any components from ecosystems, ecosystems become impoverished and their functioning inhibited. As we remove more and more of those components, ecosystems become corrupted towards and eventually beyond the point of collapse. Extinctions result in loss of that inherent property of ecosystems, resilience, the essential quality that maintains them without external intervention, other than that to which they are already accustomed. Without the resilience generated by the integrity of its own biodiversity, nature is like a wheelless car with an empty fuel tank, a house built on a bog, an orchestra without instruments, functioning at best below par. How about, as a slightly mischievous analogy for the sorry plight of biodiversity today, Superman surrounded by chunks of kryptonite. No matter which way he turns, there it is glowing at him, green, interfering with his resilience. If we remove ecosystems entirely, humans have proved themselves quite capable of that. Landscapes degenerate into bland uniformity. But it's not only aesthetically dull, it is also to our own disadvantage. We are not only a very ingenious problem-solving species, but we're also the authors of the many problems that we ourselves have devised, and which, in many cases, threaten our continued existence. The harm that we inflict on ecosystems is one of those problems which we, not having any true influence over time or biological evolution, will prove to be unable to solve. Therefore, we must stop harming ecosystems. If, as a sapient species, we don't soon pull up our collective socks, the biblical recommendation that we should subdue the earth and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth, will, we should have seen it coming, prove to have been very bad advice. On this planet, each life form is dependent on the survival of others and the whole. We share this place with all the rest of biodiversity, not dominate. It is deeply hubristic to suppose that Earth is ours to spoil for our own instant gratification, because in the long run, harming it will predictably lead to our demise, our own extinction. I offer no apology for ending a discussion of Scottish forestry with such a doom-laden prediction. The insensitive clear felling of the spruce plantations is but a small fraction of a huge worldwide problem, almost as varied as biodiversity itself. We must take action now to stop biodiversity losses, for we are already losing the knowledge of nature as it used to be, not so very long ago, before humans became so numerous that they could cause irreversible harm, and even wipe themselves out.